True Lies, Executive Decision, The Siege, Rules of Engagement. What do these movies have in common? They are all terrorist-oriented cinema, all released years before the September 11th attacks. More specifically, they're jihadist terrorist films. According to Thomas Riegler, cinema highlighted the emerging danger of religiously inspired mass terror on home soil years before 2001. Why? The Cold War might have something to do with it. Thomas Riegler goes on to write, "The end of the Cold War brought a brief period of easing. Instead of ideological or religious zealots, apolitical terrorists dominated. Perhaps, but film terrorists of the past were ethnically varied. No, I believe I know where this religiously motivated jihadist terrorist cinema began. And no, it was not a movie. It was the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. Riegler writes that this marked the first act of radical Islamic terrorism on US soil. For those of you unfamiliar with this event, according to CNN, on February 26, 1993, Ramzi Youssef organized a truck bombing that was placed in the parking garage beneath the World Trade Center. 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 were injured by this event. And Hollywood reacted to this event with movies like True Lies and Executive Decision, and more importantly, The Siege. Carl Boggs and Tom Pollard write, "The most bizarre foreshadowing of 9/11 is Edward Zwick's popular 1998 terrorist action thriller, The Siege, which dramatizes harrowing attacks on Manhattan by Islamic fanatics organized into dispersed secret cells." Boggs and Pollard go on to write that the film seems remarkably prophetic now, but back then the concept seemed ridiculous. But what the film suggests to American audiences is that Palestinian groups like Hamas have taken their struggle across the Atlantic Ocean to the US. What does this mean for cinema, though? What it means is less of Alan Rickman demanding detonators and more of this.
They haven't asked for anything, have they?
What I'm trying to say is that movie villains shifted as a result of the 1993 bombing, and that change became catastrophic in the wake of 9/11. According to Boggs and Pollard, earlier films usually relied on absurd plot lines with cartoonish villains. Villains had obvious self-serving strategies for waging terrorist acts, such as threatening the world with nuclear catastrophe or unleashing war between the US and Soviet Union. What is particularly challenging about The Siege is that while we as an audience encounter terrorists that are still very evil, they are dedicated to what they believe to be noble aims. They are ideologically and religiously motivated.
And then you take our leader, a holy man, you put him in prison for preaching the word of God.
So now you have to learn the consequences of trying to tell to the world how to live.
However, heroes in the Hollywood narrative didn't change. For marketing purposes, Hollywood still prefers male action hero narratives drawn from the legacy of John Wayne, James Bond, Rambo, and Schwarzenegger, whose warrior roles owe more to the hypermasculine, individualistic ethos of the frontier than the routine operations of the Pentagon war machine. Do we as an audience still prefer the cowboy archetype? The defender of American ideals in the face of evil, no matter what that evil may even be? Aliens? A comet? An asteroid? Or even ourselves? What if that evil is something truly real and really close to home?
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
Hollywood's various responses to 9/11 has not only changed the way audiences processed trauma in our culture, but it has changed the way reality and authenticity is depicted on film. How was this trauma processed immediately following the events of that September day? Laura Frost writes that, for most people, 9/11 was so out of range of typical experience that there was no clear framework in which it could be assimilated. The horror that was being shown on television was commonly compared to action movies of the past couple decades, such as Die Hard, Independence Day, and Escape from New York. In fact, during the first couple months after 9/11, action flicks like Die Hard or True Lies were rented 3 times more frequently than before. Some of the similarities were uncanny, writes Jeff King. It was a strange experience to view these scenes after September the 11th. According to Thomas Riegler, 45 film projects were either scrapped, altered, or postponed. Jeff King writes that in a time of great nervousness, it became uncomfortable to use any image of the Twin Towers, so it was promptly cut out of movies set to release soon after September 11th. There was a teaser trailer for the 2002 release of Spider-Man that depicted a group of thieves flying in a helicopter getting caught in a webbing, and they were trapped between the Twin Towers. Is this in the movie? No. This was supposed to be the big reveal moment for Spider-Man in the movie, and what's left is a more awkward introduction to the character. Originally, in the 2002 Disney movie Lilo and Stitch, the big spaceship chase at the end of the movie took place in a major city, and they were not flying a spaceship, they were flying a commercial airplane. The scene was reanimated because of 9/11. The consensus was this, states Riegler: no more movies of mass destruction. Jeff King writes that fantasies of destruction, such as the apocalyptic movies of the late 90s, could be safely and easily digested at one time, but now the fantasy had become a harsh reality of sorts, and became upsetting for those who may have enjoyed the fictional versions. I think it's a strange coincidence that both Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter both premiered in 2001 following September 11th. I'm not saying that either of these franchises were created in response to 9/11. What I'm saying is that these franchises may have come at a time in which they were most needed, in a time where people needed an escape from realism. Thomas Riegler writes that monumental struggles between the forces of light and darkness were extremely popular after 9/11. Novelist Lev Grossman had this to say on the matter: Tolkien gives us the war we wish we were fighting, a struggle with a foe whose face we can see, who fights on the open battlefield, far removed from innocent civilians. On September 11th, 2001, Gideon and Jules Naudet were filming a documentary on a rookie fireman in New York, and involuntarily captured the horrific events on video. The 2002 documentary, 9/11, not only offers very rare footage of the first plane colliding with the North Tower, only 2 known videos exist of this, but it also contains the happenings that went on inside the towers before they collapsed. As Jules Naudet says about his experience from inside the towers, every 30 seconds, that same crashing sound would resonate throughout the lobby. It is perhaps the thing that will stay with me always, the realization that every time I heard this sound, it was a life that was gone. What is very troubling about documenting this event, however, is that there is almost no depiction of actual loss of human life. Frost writes, "It could be argued that the parts of 9/11 that could not be seen, could not be witnessed, are equally important and more haunting. There is almost no visual record of the loss of human life during 9/11. This absence of damaged bodies and death was echoed in the missing posters throughout Manhattan, frequently shown by the media, which gesture towards absence rather than death. This may seem like harsh criticism for a documentary that was originally just about firefighters. Perhaps what Frost is referring to is the lack of closure an audience receives when the way in which the event is depicted is cut short from the truth. Consider Michael Moore's black screen in his 2004 documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11.
We have something that has happened here at the World Trade Center. We noticed flame and an awful lot of smoke. Oh my dear.
While some critics thought of Michael Moore's use of black screen was admirable for its restraint, others thought of it as manipulative. Casting the desire to see a pathology, i.e. voyeurism, not only insinuates that there is something shameful and disrespectful about the impulse, but also that the desire itself can only and should only be addressed in low forms. Seeing physical traces of people has always been an important part of mourning. It takes that large number and makes them individual people. An example of this can be found in the 2017 documentary Titanic, 20 years later with James Cameron.
You won't find bodies at Titanic. You won't find skeletons. The bones actually dissolve into solution very rapidly at that depth. What anybody who's explored the wreck finds is pairs of shoes.
A pair of women's shoes?
Yeah.
Next to a pair of girls' shoes? These were people.
These were people. Those shoes got to the
Those
bottom
double.
on people. This is the human element. This is what people touched. It's what they lived with.
Amazing.
Frost argues that her point is not to just dwell on the most gruesome aspects of 9/11, but rather to acknowledge that there is a need for greater representation. Let's take a step back and dive back into the cowboy archetype. What I'm talking about is the strong, masculine, heroic type in movies. While villains evolved at the turn of the century, heroes predominantly stayed the same. This is especially true in the context of dramas in the years following the 9/11 documentaries. Two films that especially stand out in this case, both released in 2006, are Paul Greengrass's United 93 and Oliver Stone's World Trade Center. According to Carl Boggs and Tom Pollard, United 93 is the first Hollywood film to depict the events related to the attacks with its dramatic recreation of what happened aboard one of the 4 airliners hijacked that day. What is depicted in Greengrass's film cannot be known for certain. The consensus view now is to depict the passengers aboard United 93 as heroic martyrs that prevent the plane from hitting its intended target, the White House, by crashing the plane in a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The film World Trade Center centers around the real lives of 2 New York police officers that risked their lives to save others and survived against unspeakable odds. Karen Randall summarizes Oliver Stone's intentions for the film by stating that he uses the trope of a family in crisis and the heroic rescue narrative as potentially comforting devices to represent what many still find to be a traumatic day. This movie is a triumph of the human spirit. It's about survival, it's about courage, and I think trying to link it to anything else right now would take away from what the movie is really about. It's not a downer. You walk out feeling like, yeah, angels do exist. These people are heroes. Nicolas Cage. Laura Frost emphasizes that what's immediately noticeable about most 9/11 representation to date is its emphasis on narratives of redemption, bravery, noble sacrifice, dignified human connection, and above all, heroism. In some ways, this could be a substitute for authenticity. This isn't tragedy, it's bravery. This isn't loss, this is courage. This isn't a man falling to his death. This is a fireman saving people. Frost writes that in the end of United 93, Before impact, the screen cuts to black. It does not and will not show the crash because a scene such as that would undermine the film's heroic thrust. So, what's the major problem with the black screen? There has been a recent proliferation of horror films about zombies, killer viruses, and urban apocalypses since 2001, writes Frost. And these films can be read as metaphorical commentaries on the political climate in the United States following 9/11. You might be asking, why does this bring us to horror? I'll get to that. 17 psychological studies were conducted after the events of 9/11, and psychologists were able to single out the witnessing of falling people as a major predictor of PTSD. What had come to be understood is that elimination, retreat, and censorship were not the answer. In fact, Laura Frost writes, the suppression or censorship of particularly awful images that were intended to protect the viewers from being traumatized, in fact reinforced the traumatic nature of the events. Previously it was mentioned that the desire to see the full extent of trauma that 9/11 caused was labeled as voyeurism, and the impulse was considered low and disrespectful. The horror genre, however, has always been considered low and disrespectful. And, according to Laura Frost, it's this very cultural position that has enabled the horror genre to be able to respond to disaster in the most clear-cut and direct way. The horror genre quickly picked up on using 9/11 imagery in its films. The trailer to M. Night Shyamalan's 2008 film, The Happening, was heavily criticized for its striking similarity to images of 9/11 jumpers. We, however, are going to talk about a different horror film that came out in 2008, a film that was heavily influenced by the 2002 Naudette documentary, Cloverfield, directed by Matt Reeves. This is a found footage film about a giant monster attacking Manhattan. So, why does this film work? What makes this film the answer to how trauma is depicted on film? For starters, what makes the film work is that its style is way more important than even the monster, the characters, heroism, courage, or even survival. The monster is, in a way, besides the point, writes Frost. The film's real interest is in its own camera work. These camera techniques and their studied artlessness are meant to establish narrative authenticity. Jeff King writes that absences or reduced quality of images, such as shaky camera work, dodgy focus, or awkward zooms, signify that the events have not been staged for the convenience of the production of images. Coverage reacts to events, rather than the events being created for or through the images themselves. The film works for the way that it is, not what it is. What I mean by this is that Cloverfield is about its style, and how it's able to establish authenticity through that style despite its illogical premise. According to Thomas Riegler, Cloverfield reimagined the terrorist attacks as a sudden, devastating attack by a giant monster that topples skyscrapers and major landmarks. The film works because it is in poor taste. Look at the poster. Look at the poster of this film. It shows a decapitated Lady Liberty, destruction in the foreground, and the tagline reads, "Something has found us." I see vulnerability. Now, this poster could have been an homage to the 1981 John Carpenter film Escape from New York, but some have argued that it may be a parody of the poster to United 93. An alternate poster to United 93 contains the tagline, "On September 11th, one of the darkest days in our history, 40 ordinary people sat down as strangers and stood up as one." I see heroism. Look at the poster to World Trade Center. A true story of courage and survival. I see heroism, heroic firefighters, collapsing buildings, gaping spectators, and black screens were the main tropes of mainstream representations of 9/11, and specifically the images that were substituted for human devastation. Cloverfield uses these very conventions and turns them upside down through parody. Yes, parody. Cloverfield even ends with a cut to black. Yes, Cloverfield used the same black screen that Fahrenheit 9/11 and United 93 used. For a film that is, if anything, excessively demonstrative, the black screen here seems to serve a more calculated purpose. The black screen of reticence seems pretentious and meaningless in a film that operates through visual excess. This is what executive producer of Cloverfield, J.J. Abrams, has to say about the film. We live in a time of great fear. Having a movie that is about something as outlandish as a massive creature attacking your city allows people to process and experience that fear in a way that is incredibly entertaining and incredibly safe. What this film does is it defangs the power of fear for its audience. Karen Randall writes that audiences are allowed to assimilate through referentiality, not explicit narrative.
You can hear glass breaking.
Are you there? Are you there?
Then it cut off.
These referential narratives displace trauma, and audiences are allowed to safely return to New York City, where it all started, to the site of the trauma. After 11 years had passed since the events of September 11th, 2001, the Avengers defended New York City up against an alien invasion of outrageous proportions, a movie full of explosions, destruction, death, fear, courage, heroism, and sacrifice. The Hollywood film form offers audiences the familiar language of heroes and villains in order to fully realize this psychological return. Thank you for listening.